Okay.
We're rolling.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and Chag Sameach, and I am truly honored to be able to give this presentation, which is on Jews of the interwar period. It is complex. In some situations, I've gone to early history with some of the countries. In other situations, I've gone right into the 1920s. So first, we look at some one of the best sources for my current work on Jews in interwar Europe, besides what was found on the internet, is a book called On the Eve by Bernard Wasserstein. He's taken a very thematic view rather than a straight history view, but his insights are absolutely terrific. So let's begin first with the overview. And the ongoing generalizations about Jews in interwar Europe were A, we were Christ killers, B, devils with horns, C, subversive revolutionaries, I love this, always been a theme, D, capitalist exploiter, either an upholder of an antiquated religion, that's what we call triumphalism and secessionism, the eternal stranger, and yes, the bearer of either a reactionary antiquated faith or decadence, that is just that still a society destroying decadence and modernism. So now let's see some generalities in terms of the self-perceptions of Western and Central European Jews. First of all, the reality that they were citizens of nations. They were the citizens of nations in every country where they lived, which was truly a breakthrough. That they were definitely, for the most part of a growing and ever expanding middle class, and that when given the opportunity to enter the mainstream and given the opportunity to fully fulfill their potential, Jews of interwar Europe did what Jews have often did, and that is create stellar accomplishments in science, academics, theater, literature, painting, sculpture, music, theater, film, science, and mathematics. And I forgot to talk about philosophy. So the truly dramatic situations. In the 1930s, all that positivity comes back, and the trolls rise from the bottom of the bridge, and so we see caricatures and stereotypes, truly hideous stereotypes, begin to reemerge. We see openly anti-Semitic movements and political parties continue to grow and increase in strength. Violence against Jews increases dramatically. And as Bernard Wasserstein said so well, the image of the Jew deteriorates from citizen to hated alien to haunted victim. So we're going to begin strolling quick through some of the interesting aspects of the Republic of Austria. So we know that a classic pattern, if you look at the top, was that Jews go through this perennial cycle of acceptance and expulsion, acceptance and expulsion, return and expulsion, return and expulsion. Sometimes this was at the instigation of the Roman Catholic Church, sometimes by the kings and princes who did what? Owed the Jews money. They've been lending to them. And sometimes at the instance of Christian artisans and craft guilds who perceived the Jews to be potential rivals. Does this pattern sound familiar to people? Any thoughts? And there were times in American history that those feelings and expressions and those caricatures appeared in the literature of the late 19th century, then again in the 1920s, and then again quite virulently in the 1930s. So Franz Joseph I and Joseph were greatly admired among the Jews. Joseph II's mother was a virulent anti-Semite who did everything possible to undo the progress and mobility that the Jews had experienced and reintroduced discriminatory measures. And that was just combination of religious anti-Semitism and pure snobbery. Joseph II expands those rights, however, with the Toleranzpatent of 1782. So we see that all restrictions against the Jews were lifted, and Jews could own land. Very different situation in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And even in places like pre-First World War Galicia, Jews could own land. And they didn't need to rely on a prince or overlord to grant them that. Now let's look at some names. So one way that the Jews were distinguished, because these names were given primarily by Joseph II, was the whole idea of colorful names. So you have Rosenblum, Rosenfeld, Rosengarten, Rosenbahn, Blumenfeld, Blaustein, Grünberg, Grauer, Schwarz. That should be Grünbaum, Kirschenbaum, Lindenbaum, Apfel, okay, and Löwenberg, yeah, could also mean someone from Lemberg, but it also can be, Lion Mountain, and Dreyfus. Does anybody know of another group of people in the German-speaking world who were given these loud names? Okay. Anyone been to the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area? If you went, German Anabaptists were sort of singled out and marked also with very colorful names. So if you went to a Mennonite, Amish or Mennonite graveyard in the Lancaster area, you would see these kinds of names. Then they were named often after in the second session, professions. So you had Schreiber, Schwimmer, Schumann, okay, Schuster, Juwelier, dealing with Jews, being a jeweler, Goldman, someone working in gold, Lender, that's obvious, Goldhaber, someone who possessed gold, often for being in the gold trading and in the art of producing gold. Träger, which means carrier. Reichmann, someone, a rider. Eisner, okay, dealing with iron. Zeichner, dealing with designing or painting or some form of leading. Feldmann, Feldhammer, again, people who worked in the fields of one kind or another or owned fields that they supervised. Weiner, clear. Weinstein, again, wine the idea of wine being a vintner connected to that. Muller or Miller, Gartner, gardener, Hausmann, someone who was a house servant. Okay, and then the third was location names. So Breslauer, Krakauer, Berliner, Waldmann, Prager, Wiener, Proskauer, Pressburger, Frankfurter, Flossheimer, so it should be, famous Flossheimer shoes were made. And there were Jewish shoemakers who shoe businesses outside of Austria when they got to the UK or the United States. Strasburger, from the city of Strasbourg, which is in Alsace and moved back and forth between France and Germany later. Lemberger, so a resident of Lemberg or Lvov. So if I say the word, the family name, because a colleague who has this name, Metzinger, does anyone have any idea where her origins would have been, deep in her family? That would be the city of Metz in Alsace-Lorraine. Then you have the biblical names, or the class, one of the three classes of Jews traditionally. So you have Yaakov, Mendel, often from Menachem, Mendelssohn, then you have Rachel, Moses, Abraham, the family name Abrams, and then Levi, Levin, Loeb, Lovenstein, Cohen. All right, we now move to 1867. And Franz Joseph emancipates and gives all the Jews in the Habsburg Empire full emancipation and full citizenship. And all adult males, including Jewish males, could vote. The women voters were given the franchise in the Republic of Austria pretty well into the 20th century. Jews played an increasingly significant role in science, mathematics, medicine, psychoanalysis as the century began. And so let's look at some famous Jews, first from the Vienna succession of the turn of the century to before World War I. Of course, Mahler, who actually at one point found himself forced to convert to Christianity because he could not be a conductor under the German Reich at that point. But you have Arnold Schoenberg, Alvin Berg, famous authors and playwrights, Arthur Schnitzler, Karl Kraus, Elias Canetti, a little bit later, Joseph Roth, a very interesting man, quite neurotic, but very interesting man, and Vicky Baum. And of course, you had Sigmund Freud, Viktor Frankl, Albert Adler. And then you have certain folks who were sort of shared by the culture of pre-war Germany and post-war Austrian Republic and pre-war Austria and the pre-war Austria and the Austrian Republic. One of the most important journals was of course, was the Neue Freie Presse, and one of their reporters was Theodor Herzl. What did Theodor Herzl observe and where that triggered his commitment to a much more nationally oriented and ideological Zionism? Bum, 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 bum. Anyone out there? Don't be afraid.
The trial of Dreyfus.
Right, the Dreyfus. Well, right, absolutely. Okay, and there is a joke, and of course, Karl Lueger, whom we'll get to in a minute, called it, the Judenpresse, and so did anti-Semites in the 1930s. But there's an old joke that where one Jewish man goes up to another Austrian Jewish man and says, so tell me, do you keep kosher? No. Do you observe a Shabbat? No. Do you observe the high holy days? No. Are you involved in, do you do any study of Jewish history? No. So what do you do that's Jewish? I read the Neue Freie Presse. That was such a big influence on Jewish culture and Viennese culture. And of course, one of the people playing, then we faced this horrible reactionary Christian socialist, Karl Lueger. And you can read volumes about him. And he railed against the Jews, their leaders and their influence on Viennese cultural life. So one of those paid close attention was a failed painter, and he was Adolf Hitler. There's a phrase that Robertson Davies, the great novelist and Jungian, says that evil is the revenge of the unlived life. One wonders if he had a glorious career as a painter and socialized, with Jews in this Vienna secession period, it might have been different. And fortunately, Lueger had a great opponent, none other than Emperor Franz Joseph, who neutralized his influence and worked to protect my Jews. Does anyone from Galiciana or other Austrian Empire background know what the Jews of the Austro-Hungarian Empire called him? Freim Yossel. That's how beloved he was by the Jews of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Freim Yossel, he's one of us. Okay. Unfortunately, Franz Joseph and his government made a dreadful decision, and that was to directly, rather than having Bosnia-Herzegovina as a protectorate that was sort of authorized by sort of international European treaties, they decided to annex Bosnia-Herzegovina, and it precipitates the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife on the 28th of June, 1914. And then one thing escalates to one situation to another, to another, to another, to another, and to another. And by August, there is this horrendous war breaking out, the Great War, as it was called then. And Jewish soldiers and officers, whether on the Allied side or the Central Powers side, served with great distinction. And also, when they were working to protect local populations, they did so during the Russian campaign, because the Russians were incredibly vicious and murderous to the Jews, even though there were Jews also in the Imperial Russian Army. Jews in the regions made serious attempts to flee to the west, and there was where the Joint Distribution Committee first emerged as a force. It did what it could to protect those refugees. And serving under the Austrian direction was a socialist named Marshal Josef Pilsudski, and he eventually played a major role in the post-war Polish Republic. We'll get to him next week. So, life in the new Austrian Republic. The Jewish influence was very strong, and the Austrian Democratic, there were two parties, but the Austrian Social Democratic Party was the first political party to welcome the Jews. They were not Marxist-Leninists, they were reformists, and they followed the teachings of Karl Kautsky and not Lenin, okay? In virtually all of the countries that we're going to talk about, you will see that that is one of the two political parties they were drawn to. The other was the Liberal Party, okay? And they were also reformist, very committed to civil liberties, to democratic freedoms, and to a culture of inclusion and cultural evolution. And the Jewish leaders included Otto Bauer and Julius Eckstein. The base of the Jewish, the base of the Jews who were involved in the Social Democratic Party were not often workers themselves, certainly not at that time, but they were often academics and school teachers and civil servants. The others began to include with a centrist Liberal Party, which shared democratic values, but was also more representative of the merchant and business classes. It was also very supportive of civil liberties and strong civil society and educational opportunity. Jews at that time were already 10% of the population of Vienna. So the extent of their influence was huge. Has anyone traveled to Austria? Sorry, to Vienna? Okay. If you took a tram or a metro from the center of Vienna, you would go to the 4th district, which was Leopoldstadt. And that was one of the most significant Jewish neighborhoods, and it still is if you take a visit to Vienna. Interestingly enough, the higher percentage of Jewish Social Democratic voters were found in a more affluent area called Alzeggrund. And you can just see now the impact of the Jewish presence in Vienna. And there was, again, a shuttle, we'll see when we get to Germany, between Austria and Weimar Germany, Republican Austria and Weimar Germany. Okay. The first Congress of Jewish Women was convened in 1923, and its leader was Mildred Heinisch, who not only worked hard to assist Jewish refugees and support them from the East, but was a strong supporter of the Zionist movement. Okay. And people ask, what were the major denominations of those Jews who practiced religion? And in everyday life, this is very similar to Weimar Germany, they were very secular, involved in the world, involved in work in general culture, the sciences, the arts, psychoanalysis. But those who were practicing belonged to either a mainline Orthodox Judaism, very, very mainstream movement, not very different from modern Orthodoxy in Germany. So there was not a there wasn't a terrible conflict if you were part of this mainline modern Orthodox movement. And so, like the consistorial movement, the United Synagogue in the United Kingdom, the consistorial movement in France, and the United Kingdom, the United Synagogue in South Africa, ritual practices by affiliated Orthodox Jews could be sporadic. Some would be very fervent. Some would be affiliated with the Orthodox Jews for certain points, in times in their life cycle, or at least observance of the high holidays and festivals, if not every Shabbat. Liberal Judaism prized itself on a magnificent musical aesthetic, very elegant, very very warm, very rational in its religious outlook, but a tremendous emphasis on aesthetics. Its leaders included the choral director Solomon Sulzer, and those who have sung with our Road of Shirah choir will remember Hallelujah, Hallelujah, dum, 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 dum. Okay, and two of the most famous rabbis included Ihem Mannheimer and Yosef Jelinek. And the Vienna City Temple was this great magnet for not only religious observers, but people who came just to hear the performances and the music of Sulzer. Unfortunately, a cloud was rising over the horizon with a potential menace to both social democrats and liberals. And the name of that person was Engelbert Dollfuss. And as the 20s moved on, he became increasingly influential and powerful. And that will be problematic for the Jewish community in the 1930s. Now let's get to France. We'll deal quickly a little bit of the overview historically. As true with many of the European countries, Jews began to settle during the late and early medieval period, which Provence, the Midi, which were places like Montpellier and Toulouse, and Narbonne, in which called French Catalonia now, Perpignan, also French Catalonia, the Massif Central. They also were present in the Massif Central, particularly Clermont-Ferrand. The synagogues were established. If you read any interesting works on the history of synagogue development, I think of my teacher, Lawrence Hoffman, you would see that they were served at the early point by Kohanim who were really Chazanim, and their lay leadership played an important role. So you can see, if you look at synagogues from the mid to late Roman period, even earlier, you'll hear this Arch Synagoga. The Arch Synagoga was the administrator, okay, and the Pater Synagoga was also the administrator. The Arch Synagoga was a woman, and so there was a significant role for women. And in these earlier synagogues, there wasn't the separation between men and women in synagogue became several centuries later. There was comity sometimes. So when the Bishop of Arles, who recognized the Jews and was a friend of the Jews, Arles, of course, along with Nîmes and Avignon, major cities in Provence, they sang songs and hymns together at sacred occasions and later at the bishop's funerals. Now, whether there was some kind of Judaizing Christian, what we call Petrine Christian movement involved in those communities was not clear so far from my research. They settled earlier. The first settlement in Paris was right in the middle, the Ile de la Cité, where a synagogue was established. And wonder of wonders, it was burned down and the Jews were banished. And you see under Charlemagne and the Visigoth rulers, there is protection, and the public was very favorable toward them because of the variety of skills and talents that they brought. And here came this ad infinitum: expulsion, brought back again; expulsion, brought back again; expulsion, brought back again. One of the kings at that time, Philippe Auguste, invited them, beat them, and robbed them of their possessions. Now, when particularly, for what reason, what occurred that often led to those expulsions? Take a guess, please. Anyone out there? What had the kings accumulated with respect to the Jews?
Too much debt.
Huge debt, right? And when were they invited back? When they felt, oh, good, we can find a way to exploit them again. There was also, under the sainted Louis IX, there's a whole controversy about naming changing the name of the square and the cathedral in New Orleans because of his record. So he ordered the burning of several volumes of the Talmud, and with church support, he initiated these forced disputations, which rabbis were forced to argue as to the validity of their first faith versus Christianity. Does anyone know why Nachmanidis, the great Ramban, was expelled?
Because he won his disputation.
He won the debate.
Not to kill him.
He won the debate. Okay, so
there's a really good movie version with Christopher Lee. If anybody wants to watch a
that would be wonderful.
Jew on the Line.
Wow, what was the name of it again?
It's just called The Disputation. I'll put the link in the chat.
Okay, that'll be great. Then, of course, during the Crusades, there was a massacre. Many were murdered and burned alive if they refused to be converted. And of course, from the point of view of the Jews, they martyred themselves al kiddush Hashem, to sanctify God's name. So one of the examples was in the city of Rouen in Normandy. And I'm not sure, the famous sculpture of the burghers of Rouen, if anyone's seen that in France, they may have been Jews, because it would not have made terribly much sense for the Crusaders to go, to go around murdering Christians who could be of use to them. And in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, the Jews were forced to wear a rondelle, okay? And again, the purpose of wearing the rondelle, and in some communities, distinctive hats was to separate them and make them other to the rest of the community who might not have felt that way before. So they were circular badges, one worn on the chest and one worn on the back to distinguish the Jews from Christians and further increase the Jewish people's sense of alienation and isolation. And when you have that kind of separation, vulnerability and aloneness. Finally, 1394, the part of the monarchy that was controlled by the kings of France, they were expelled. I think it was Philippe the Good, Philippe the Fair, who did that. In such places, however, that were not under the province of the King of France, but either other overlords or other small kingdoms, they were either able to stay without expulsion or drift back into these parts of France, including Sephardic Jews who were moving north from Spain and Portugal, and Ashkenazic Jews from the northeast, from Alsace and Lorraine. They were finding ways to get back. So even though they were not emancipated or given equality. Does anyone know the name of a well, there are actually two, but a particular 20th century political figure, Jewish political figure of Sephardic ancestry? He's quite a giant, and not only a resistor, part of the resistance, but a former premier and a supporter of Israel. Pierre Mendès France, okay, the Mendez will give you the sign that he's of Sephardic Portuguese ancestry. So let's now move, okay, to the golden age of religious scholarship in medieval France. And of course, we have Rashi as the greatest preeminent rabbinic scholar of that period. So first in the city of Troyes, which was the capital of Champagne, and if you look at their photos of the narrow streets in which Rashi lived, and those classic buildings that had the combination of wood plaster hatching, and he also made references constantly to earlier works of Midrash, and the capital of the province of Champagne. He was a vintner by trade, and if you look at his commentaries, you'll see a lot of references to that profession. And later in Mainz, in the Rhine Valley, he organized a school with an elite group of disciples, and with no sons, he educated his daughters, who educated their sons-in-law, including Shmuel ben Meir and Yudah ben Natan. The Sephardic tradition included people like Moshe Hadashan, who was more freewheeling and more mystical. There was more of that coming from the Sephardic tradition, and certainly when it came to the era of the Zohar, that was very much the process. And now, Jewish emancipation did not happen overnight, as it has not happened for African Americans and other people of color in our time. So the Jews found their way back into France. They're even mentioned with restrictions under Louis XIV. Okay, and the leaders of the early stages of the French Revolution, began to support the emancipation of Jews, the most famous Abbé Grégoire and the Count Mirabeau. There was a formal declaration of emancipation on December 22nd, 1899. But no, there was a parallel to Brown versus Board of Education. It was a very long process of achieving full citizenship and full rights. And in the case of African Americans, far from fully fulfilled even to today. So certain forces, particularly the Catholic Church and provincial leaders who saw the Jews as competition, tried to delay and annul implementation of the document. Also parallel to Brown versus Board of Education. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety was an equal opportunity, a smasher of religious life. And some synagogues were attacked, and several bourgeois Jews were accused of treason. Some of them were executed. The names of the months changed as well as the calendar. So you get Brumaire and other names having to do with the seasons of the year. And most distressing for the Jews, a week consisted of 10 days. I think it was 10 weeks of 10 days. So when the week consisted of 10 days, what was the most direct impact on the Jews of France?
Shabbat moves around.
Ta-da! Shabbat. If you have a 10-day week, where do you observe and when do you observe Shabbat? So it became extreme frustration. Later, however, when a very reactionary coalition determined to restore the monarchy, threatened the Republic, the Jews distinguished themselves by serving loyalty in the army of the Republic and earned the respect and support of the populace. Okay, and then we move on to Napoleon. And I think you can read all of this on your own. The Sanhedrin was convened by Napoleon, and it became the basis of the modern formal Orthodox Jewish community, the Consistoire, which became the largest denomination in France. He again reapplied restrictions in 1811, abolished them in 1818. The rights of the Jews remained status quo in this restoration, the two restoration monarch reigns of Louis XVIII and Charles X. But a new and significantly rising class rebelled, and under Louis Philippe, and the Jews became full-fledged citizens of France with all the rights and privileges of citizenship. So what was this new class of people that had had enough of Charles X and assumed really major political roles under the July monarchy? If you look at some of what they were able to achieve, it was the arrival of the bourgeoisie to real political power. And that became the locus of political power, the political leaderships. Jewish synagogues and schools received state subsidies on a par with Catholics and Protestants. And the first modern rabbinic academy opened in Metz for the consistorial movement. Okay, and then quickly we look at the Third Republic and look at all of the accomplishments. and people. Adolf Cremier, who actually became a huge influence even under the July monarchy, and founded the Alliance Israélite Universelle. He was interested in cultural acculturation, not any loss of ethnic identity or religious beliefs. He intervened with great influence to stop a blood libel in Syria, to stop, fight and challenge blood libels in Russia. And he, in the Third Republic, was served in several cabinets, including being a minister of finance. And then you have, of course, the rise when the full liberation of in the field of banking and finance, and they were all competitive. The Rothschilds, Fools, and Paredes. Baron de Hirsch became an educational advocate, financier, and reformer, and he's going to have an impact on, and did, on the Jews of Austria, in Hungary in the 19th century. But so, just as you think everything is fine and out of the water, everything's fine and things are moving, another pattern, the reaction comes in. So traditionally, Jews were known as price killers, had international financiers, economic rivals. The new anti-Semitism was different, okay, because it was tied to what are supposedly racial texts, and that there was this international conspiracy to control the world. So Jews were a race who were dangerous. They were a race who were subversive. They were a race with hideous, evil, and depraved qualities that made it impossible to justify their presence in, France. Louis Toussaint was a nationalist with a socialist zoology to describe his prescriptions of Jews as a race. Notice when we get to the rise of Hitler, National Socialism, very similar. The ideas among the military, in the Catholic Church, the old aristocracy and the shopkeepers began to drink in this kind of racial anti-Semitism. Then I think we will end with the Dreyfus affair and then finish up France and try to get into Germany in the 20s and the Netherlands in the 20s. Of course, everyone knows the story of Alfred Dreyfus, prisoner of Devil's Island. In 1896, an investigation revealed that the real culprit was Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy, who was quickly tried and acquitted by a corrupt military court. Plus ça change. Dreyfus was sentenced to an additional 20 years, set free, but not exonerated. Anti-Dreyfus propaganda appeared in Drummond's horrendous racial anti-Semite. La Libre Parole, the images were disgusting, and the right-wing Roman Catholic publication La Croix. However, something changes dramatically in the political alignments of the French Republic, precisely because of this. So large segments of the French liberal public were very suspicious of the military, extremely secular and anti-clerical, and they were outraged by what happened to Dreyfus and contemptuous of anti-Semitism. So Georges Clemenceau, through his publication L'Aurore, editor of L'Aurore, Anatole France, Henri Poincaré, were in the camp of the Dreyfusards. Maurice Borès, Edward Drummond, and the young Charles Maurras, who would torture the Jews later in the 1940s, were anti-Dreyfusards. Finally, Dreyfus was formally acquitted under their pressure and promoted to major. Clemenceau and Poincaré would remain allies of the Jews and founded a new secular liberal party, the Parti Radical. So a liberalization, an expansion, an era of much more inclusion certainly became the order of the day. And in World War I, French Jews served with distinctions in the military, earned respect from their countrymen, also lost a tremendous number of their own of soldiers serving to fight for the French. And even the former anti-Semite Maurice Barrès was called them now a spiritual faith. Drummond died in 1924, and anti-Semitism was in full retreat. So I think we're pretty much at the end. Let me just show you one more piece of all the accomplishments and leaders in the 1920s, also in the what we call La Belle Époque. And I think we'll stop here and we'll look more next week at the Jews of France in the 1920s, and then also the tensions in the 1930s. B becomes a pattern. Okay, just as remember in the story of Joseph, just as Joseph is reaching the apogee of his leadership, his viceroy, and being Zaphnath Paneah, what happens? The brothers come calling. In 3 countries, in at least 3 of these countries, these Ostjuden, these Jews from Russia, Slovakia, and Hungary bring a totally different mindset, Yiddish language, politically more radical, and become tradespeople, artisans, manufacturers. And then in the 1920s, they outnumber the native French Jews who really practiced the principle of laïcité, proud Jews, but completely integrated into the secular life, produces a culture shock and major trauma. With that in mind, we'll try to reorganize the schedule a little bit, but we'll continue with Jews in the Netherlands from 1919 through 1929. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions just before we end? Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you, Rabbi Schuman. We're
Thank
really
you, Rabbi.
excited for next Saturday
Thank you,
morning
Rabbi.
for part 2.
right.
Very interesting.
And if we don't finish everything in the next session, we'll try to rearrange something later in the year to look at some of the other countries more fully. Thank you. Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom. And it's been an honor to serve you.
Right, shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Thank you, Bert.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks a
Thank you.
bunch.
My pleasure.